Good afternoon or good evening, depending on where you might be. My name is Kevin Michael Grace, and this is the KMG show for Friday, July the 15th, 2022. So, I guess you've all been waiting for me to deliver my verdict on the Lauren Southern versus Paul Joseph Watson, a contretemps, and I haven't watched her video, and I don't think I'm going to. It's almost 3 hours long. Also, she's being interviewed by Blair White, a trans woman. That does not bespeak seriousness to my mind. And yeah, this guy was really into me, but I wasn't into him. And he wanted to push it farther than I wanted to go. And he was really so upset. That's what politics have been reduced to. But let's talk about a different woman here. And her name is Penny Mordaunt. And she is one of the leading candidates, perhaps the leading candidate, for the new leader of the Conservative Party of Great Britain and Northern Ireland, and thus Prime Minister. She finished second in the first MP voting after Rishi Sunak, a paper citizen. But it turns out that we don't know all that much about Penny Mordaunt. I certainly didn't. I said some things about her, a couple of weeks ago, saying that I liked her because she is a pretty lady with a good figure and a nice smile. But I suppose that's not enough. A very amusing piece by Will Lloyd at Unheard called Penny Mordaunt is Hard to Read. Penny Mordaunt is the only candidate in this leadership election whose formative political experience was war. She claimed this week that she knew she was a conservative as soon as she watched Margaret Thatcher's Naval Task Force sail from Portsmouth Harbor as the Falklands War began in 1982. The ships, the uniforms, the flags. Mordaunt saw the pomp and the guns, and her thoughts turned to Westminster. She was distant enough from the blood and the smoke to be made optimistic by the conflict. This buttery patriotism is one part of Mordaunt's political makeup. There is also a Cameroonian social liberalism, pro-immigration, and pro-alphabet people rights. She is a Brexiteer. Her breezy, sunny style is giggly and Johnsonian. Mordaunt appears to not take herself very seriously. She wants to smooth Tory edges, get the party back to basics, and embody a cuddly new one nation synthesis. Her battered country and her fratricidal party are not really in trouble. They just need to rediscover who they are. Like every centrist, for that is what Mordaunt is, she thinks all sensible people share the same values. Will Lloyd continues, political colleagues say they have no idea what she believes or thinks. Only 11% of the public and 16% of conservative voters can correctly name Penny Mordaunt when shown a photo of her. But Tory members, though they are old, anti-immigration, and disconcerted by social change, appear charmed as young, pro-immigration, social change welcoming candidate. The heart wants what it wants. It helps that she is never less than vague. We don't need a new role in the world just to be ourselves, she said in her speech. For party members, she is a bare wall. They can light her with their flickering projections. A supposed mystery might be welcomed by the public too, after the too graphic, pointillist detail Boris Johnson forced on Britain about his own life. Being unknown looks like a political advantage. Compared with her rivals, Mordaunt's political career has been low wattage. Her family's military background and her sideline as a naval reservist made her appointment as Secretary of Defense in 2019 a realized dream. It lasted for 2 months. She backed Jeremy Hunt in that year's leadership contest. For that, Johnson removed her from the post. Luckily for us, Mordaunt used the downtime that followed to write a book, quote, to learn more about my country. Intentionally and unintentionally, Greater, Britain After the Storm, Oigewalt, is filled with useful disclosures. Though it is written with a co-author, the book feels more distinctly personal than anything else Mordaunt has done in public. Nothing is more revealing than a person's prose, not even nudity. The bare bones. After the financial crash, Brexit, and COVID, Britain needs a well executed national plan. We are a country longing for a mission. Though we are apparently living longer, healthier, happier, wealthier lives than ever before, the median Brit, like the nation at large, lacks self esteem. Only Mordaunt's planned mission, a project outlined with no more specificity than the frequent use of the word modernize, can make Britain better. Greater divides into two parts. The first is an attempt to capture Britain's national character through historical analysis, amateur sociology, and hair thin observations. The second purports to explain what this national plan will look like. If Mordaunt's planned mission is to work, it must be grounded in an understanding of what contemporary Britain is truly about. Early doors, she informs us that the British live on an island, which is indisputable. Afterwards, she makes a cacophony with adjectives. Britain is industrious, international, cautious, creative, caring, trusted, frugal, fair, selfless, and modest. Then more word confetti. Britain is defined by integrity, sacrifice, honesty, modesty, loyalty, humor, compassion, generosity, love, courage, and defiance. All of these nouns could be lobbed at Cambodia and hit something. They are general, banal. Her words are indiscriminate, not accurate. Without precision, observation shrivels and dies. We can admire her attempt to taxonomize an entire country, but not the outcome. Is her writing better than her diving? No. Every cliche about this country is on parade. Before politics, Mordaunt worked in public relations. She knows received wisdom, aimed low, communicated breathlessly. Play the hits, Penny. Tell us about how much the British love queuing and moaning about the weather. She does, a lot. Though Britain is an ancient civilization, not compared with Iran or China or Egypt or any world standard, but whatever, she's rolling. It is surprisingly modern and outward looking, yet we are also suspicious of change. Sometimes, she writes, being British is difficult to explain. It's a sentence where the author's unintended admission of failure lurks between each word. When Mordaunt essays the national character over about 100 pages, she falls back on recapping 70s TV shows and odd little factoids. Quote, the majority of Britons eat meat pie at least once a month, unquote, the ultimate significance of which remains obscure. How many meat pies affect Mordaunt's plan mission is never explained. Though she lambasts Britain's apparent tendency towards nostalgia several times in the book, she is imprisoned by outdated notions. Her Britain of queues, rain, and Sunday rituals was a stock image when George Orwell wrote about it during the Second World War. The actual Britain, a bewildering mixture of hypermodernity and feudalism, where personal identity is thin, beliefs are fluid, and people mobile, is richer and stranger than anything Mordaunt can conceive of. But she would rather think about breakfast. She ticks off a full English's ingredients, then writes, quote, not surprisingly, after such breakfast bowel bashing, there blossoms a stool of biblical proportions. Exodus by Caesarean section, unquote. Oh dear. It matters that Mordaunt cannot articulate a single original vision about the national character. Disraeli intuited that the working classes were patriotic friends, not revolutionary enemies, and reformed Britain accordingly. Churchill understood that pig-headed British stubbornness could save the nation in 1940, when many in the establishment around him were defeatist. Thatcher understood that baby boomers wished to eschew the clammy paternalistic collectivism of the post-war period for greater individual autonomy. Their visions were underpinned by new understandings of old national qualities. Mordaunt sounds like a folksy Hovis advert, not a prime minister. The language and the ideas are pavements that have been walked over many times. Her belief that Scotland won't leave the Union is grounded in the notion that the Scots, like the English and the Welsh and the Northern Irish, moan about the weather. If this were funny, it might excuse the observation's total lack of seriousness. But if you care about Britain, it's tragically shallow. Typically, other than this empty cliche, Mordaunt does not have a positive case for make for the Union. She does not seem entirely convinced that it should carry on. If the Union matters, she claims, it needs to be clear why. If the UK is to survive, its existence can't be taken for granted. That's just another truism in a book stuffed with them. It is impossible to imagine Disraeli, Churchill, or Thatcher, or yes, even Johnson, thinking this flacidly. The big idea in Greater is modernization. Mordaunt's plan mission must start with modernizing democracy, which means fiddling about yet again with the House of Lords. Is kicking a few aristos around really more important than dealing with the country's appalling productivity rate, stagnant GDP, and demented planning regulations? Mordaunt seems to think so. Modernization starts with Parliament, then ripples out towards the BBC, the military, the monarchy, the sciences, and the universities. What modernization means is never explained. It is taken for granted that reform is a synonym for good. Will Lloyd continues, but more than anything else, Greater feels random. This is what happens when you try to be all things to all men in the Blair Cameron way, but you are not rigorous or thoughtful about it. In no particular order and with no particular reason, Mordaunt quotes from John Stuart Mill, Margaret Mead, Richard Rorty, Billy Connolly, Gloria Gaynor, Afua Hirsch, Clive James, Malcolm Gladwell, Joe Cox, George the Poet, and what she calls the Austrian boy wonder, Friedrich Hayek. The lack of unity here, the looseness of these associations, tells us that Mordaunt is not a structured thinker. She has no philosophy aside from a lazily Whiggish belief in that things can only get better. She would like much more immigration than the average Tory member perhaps probably realizes. Mordaunt tacks to the center but ends up on the managerial left. What she writes sounds like it was dredged from a particularly poor speech given at Davos 5 years ago. Do Tory members want to hear that change is the engine room of equality, or that minority achievement is the stuff of which our dreams, history, and culture are made up? To support this, Mordaunt evokes the lives of Horatio Nelson, Marcus Rashford, he's a soccer player, by the way, and Barack Obama. Mordaunt moves on to her plan mission. We must rethink our institutions if they are going to regain popular support, she declares. It has to be a top-down as well as a bottom-up approach. Okay, then. Government must do more, but due to its inefficiency, many of its tasks can be devolved to private charities. Big corporations are thinning out the state, but growth requires lax regulations and lower taxes. Progress will come from protecting dissenting minority opinions, but censorship is fine if it is developed by elected and accountable representatives. Otherwise, violent noises from the looniverse will wreck public discourse. People shouldn't be canceled for having different views, but she approves of Trump's Twitter ban. These grating inconsistencies cannot be papered over by her chummy, punch in the arm patriotism. No part of the plan feels like it was inspired by listening to the electorate or trying to work out what they want. Again, being a centrist means that Mordaunt thinks the British all basically believe the same things. All our differences can be dissolved in the sugar water of loving Britain. All our problems can be fixed with a bit of joined up thinking about House of Lords reforms. She wants to heal us. At her launch on Wednesday, Mordaunt claimed the public were fed up with divisive policies. We need to get back to saner, kinder politics. Miniature Union Jacks, tolerance, fair play, compromise. Britain, she said Wednesday, with a characteristic pop culture reference, felt like the crowd watching Paul McCartney at Glastonbury last month. We have digressed from the classics. Quote, he was playing new tunes, but what we really wanted was the good old stuff, unquote. For Mordaunt, then, playing the good old stuff means regurgitating a tired centrism. At this point, modernization is the shadow of a shadow, the echo of an echo. Maybe it doesn't matter. And Will Jones continues, or concludes rather, current polling suggests Mordaunt will beat any other candidate if she makes the final round. Scrutiny, starting with this evening's television debates, ought to see her big tent ideas from a previous age collapse in on themselves. What if they don't? The conditions that made Cameron and Blair possible are not going to come back. Saying that Britain can rediscover itself does not make it so. Real life has not been amenable to these ideas like Mordaunt's for over a decade. If the torch is being passed to her, do not expect its light to carry very far. Uh, yes, and this is called Penny Mordaunt is Hard to Read by Will Lloyd at unheard.com. I'm reminded that this terrible title for the book. Hang on, just let me find the exact title here. Greater, colon, Britain After the Storm. These political books by candidates or would-be candidates tend to strive for that sort of rubbish. You might recall that Selena Meyer's book, which was ghostwritten by one of her backroom boys, was called Some New Beginnings. Yes, Some New Beginnings. And you don't want to be too clear about your objectives. You want to be a blank slate. And afterwards, you can say, well, it's, you thought that I was going to deliver this and I didn't. You didn't think I was going to deliver that, but I did. Well, I mean, it's not as if I made it clear what I stand for, so you're not in any position to judge me. Let's go to the chat. Hello to Anrun, Dan, Allison, Be Curious, Olycus. Hauper says, somewhere a female country singer is missing a stage name. Thanks, Lauren Southern. Hello to the Mighty Puck 75. That's a new one to me. People whose names begin with Mo. All right. Anwin says, so the terrible Boris is going to be replaced by someone equally bad. What a shock. Hello to Visionary Companion. Mercurius Olycus says, just what Britain needs, another empty cipher. Halper says she has a vastly better head of hair than Bojo. That's change we can believe in. Hello to Art Mob. Chogakin 666. John Major used to carry on about, people cycling to church on Sunday, this sort of thing. That was back in the 90s, and people thought, what decade is he living in? Now, this is 30 years later, and Penny Mordaunt is still carrying on. I suspect that Peggy Mordaunt would be horrified by the idea of spinsters cycling to church on Sunday. But that's the sort of thing one says. Of course, one of the things that one doesn't say is how much you hate Dad's army. Transphobic, homophobic, sexist, misogynist, etc., etc., etc. I mean, she made it clear with that statement that the Tories who are, let's say, 50 years old and older, she hates everything about them. But she is pretty. Has a nice head of hair, good figure, lovely smile, and perhaps that will be enough. Visionary Companion says Emma Webb was touting an African perspective prime minister. Maybe she was kidding. I think I know the one that you're talking about. Last name Badenoch. Dear Lord, what a description of a breakfast aftermath, says Mercurius Olycus. I have never been fond of the British breakfast, the full British breakfast. These blackened tomatoes, ugh. But I know that the Brits love them. I mean, I am half British, but perhaps if I got the other 50%, then I would approve of blackened tomatoes. Anrun says her name brings to mind the villain in the Arthurian saga. Ah, yes, indeed. Indeed. Hello to Quachalongo. UK fish from Russian fishing boats, canola oil to cook the chips from Ukraine, says Art Mob. Diva Fever, I think that's a new name, says just had 2 micro power cuts in southeast England. SHTF about to go down. Oh, who else do we have? Austrian boy wonder. I had my hopes up for a second or two, said Anrun. Who would describe Hayek? Hayek lived to be quite old, if I recall correctly, and he seemed to be old even when he was young. Boy wonder indeed. Okay. Told academic agent 99 Iron Duke and 20 other of the top decadent right wing about KMG. Well, thank you for that. I saw some of that on Twitter. And anyone excited to see the woman KMG? Says David the Gnome. I don't quite know what that means. We're here because we're here because we're here because we're here, says Mercurius Olicus. That is the best definition of patriotism that I know of. I know it's common for people to say, the Americans are best, or the Canadians are best, or the British are best, or the French are best. These are not objective judgments. People tend to like the places where they are from, particularly if they have a history there. And so we're here because we're here because we're here. Again, that's just, as they say, John Milius famously put it, because we live here in Red Dawn. And not a structured thinker. Understatement, says Mercurius Olicus. Now, there is a reason why politicians are deliberately vague. Even after they have attained power. And we can see what happens to people these days if they are not deliberately vague. This is from the BBC. A councillor has been suspended for allegedly sharing tweets claiming mosques were hiding secret arsenals and immigration was cultural suicide. The Conservative Party is investigating Alana Vine, councillor for Bramall North in Stockport, which is just outside Manchester. Ms. Vine declined comment on her suspension when contacted by the BBC. Stockport Council's Conservative group confirmed it had initiated disciplinary procedures against the councillor after a recent complaint. A statement from the group read, "The Conservative Party takes complaints of this nature extremely seriously." The group said it would be making no further comment until the investigation has concluded. Among the most contentious retweets in question was a post reading, "How many mosques have secret arsenals just waiting for when our troops are elsewhere in the world?" And another tweet described an area of Manchester as being like in Somalia. The post added, "Hundreds of Somalian asylum seekers were placed there many years ago. There are thousands of them. Seeing is believing. They live no differently than they did in Somalia." Another tweet claimed population growth and rates of migration between 2011 and 2021 were, quote, "cultural suicide," unquote. I used to think that bringing large numbers of people from Jamaica and Haiti to my country was the stupidest thing that any government could do. But, life is full of surprises, as I like to say. How about Somalia? What? It's Somalia. No. Do you know that they're like a byword for terror throughout East Africa? And we want to bring them here? Nah. It's like that magic dirt that John Derbyshire talks about. As soon as they arrive at Pearson Airport, they will be magically transformed. Well, last time I saw a large group of Somalis when I was in Edmonton a couple of years ago, and I saw them leaning against walls downtown, both outside and inside, and without exception, looking sullen and murderous. Yes, the old, the Blitz spirit. You remember hearing about the Blitz spirit? And you will still hear about the Blitz spirit, even though it disappeared decades ago. This is from the aforementioned Paul Joseph Watson at Summit News. The latest hysterical moral panic requiring ever more intense levels of control freak technocracy and safetyism has been unveiled. It's hot in summer. Yes, really. Despite the fact that the UK has experienced a relatively mild summer so far, clickbait mainstream news outlets are pressing the panic button in anticipation of high temperatures across the country this weekend. The UK Met Office, a notorious peddler of climate change propaganda, is front and center warning of extreme heat over the next few days, declaring it to be a national emergency. To others, however, it's known as the middle of July or summer, and the Met Office issued a tweet what is this exclamation point in a yellow triangle, and then a red ball, red extreme heat warning issued, and then the same emojis in reverse. If it gets to 40 degrees Celsius, that's a very iconic threshold and shows that climate change is with us now, said Met Office spokesman Graham Madge. Global warming alarmists are wetting the bed. Kai Perry had tweeted, on the left is a 2020 Met Office prediction of what a 2050 summer heat wave could look like. On the right is a BBC weather forecast made this morning for this coming Tuesday. The climate crisis is real and it's happening now. Wake the F up. 40 degrees Celsius. Okay. That's, yeah. I was in London in July of 1976, the hottest summer in the century. And for 1 week in London, for an entire week, the temperature was every day over 100 degrees. And nobody thought the world was coming to an end. Nobody thought the world was coming to an end, but it's different now because, you know, climate emergency or whatever the hell you want to call it. Darren Grimes tweeted how they used to present summer versus how they present it now. And there used to be little sunlight, little suns, little happy suns on the map. And now it's red, dark red, you know, like death. Strangely, the same people who cry weather isn't indicative of climate change when skeptics point out record cold temperatures suddenly assert that, in fact, it is whenever it gets hot because they say so. Meanwhile, it's been revealed that much of the panic is based on manipulated temperature readings that are taken next to airport runways with hot jet engines and tarmac. The Daily Skeptic reports about 1/2 of all land surface temperature measurements used to show global warming and promote the command and control net zero agenda are taken near or adjacent to hot airport runways. Emeritus professors William Happer and Richard Linson recently told the U.S. government that over the last several decades, NASA and NOAA have been fabricating temperature data to argue that rising CO2 levels have led to the hottest year on record. These false and manipulated data were said to be an egregious violation of scientific method. As previously highlighted, technocrats are now calling for, and in some countries implementing, climate lockdowns in the name of saving the environment. Meanwhile, in the real world, Arctic sea ice is just 3% below its 30-year average. Doomsday climate prophecies have been proven spectacularly wrong time and again. According to a much heralded 2004 report, man-made climate change would cause millions of deaths, major European cities being sunken, nuclear war, and global environmental riots, all by 2020. It never happened. Didn't Gordon Brown, erstwhile Prime Minister of Britain, say that unless such and such was done, life as we know it on Earth would come to an end by, I believe the year was 2020. Strangely, that didn't happen. In the National Post, John Iveson is moaning about the Ukraine again. Canada's Ukrainian community will gather on Parliament Hill Sunday to protest the dangerous precedent of Canada loosening sanctions on Moscow to allow the return of a turbine to Russia. Ottawa's decision was taken because Russia claims it can't operate the Nord Stream natural gas pipeline at full capacity without the turbine, and Germany, the recipient of the gas, is trying to fill storage tanks ahead of the winter. Justin Trudeau defended what he said was a difficult decision because the sanctions are not designed to harm our allies and their populations. Well, they are, and I think they were designed to do that. But interesting here that Trudeau has decided that our Canada's relations with Germany are more important than our relations with the Ukraine. So Iveson ponders the idea of Russian assets in the West being stolen and then that money sold, and then that money being handed over to the Ukraine. On the one hand, this, on the other hand, that. It might lead to a flight of foreign investment from Canada because, well, it might get stolen. It might get stolen. You want to know something which really speaks to the heart of what Canada means? Property rights are not included in our so-called Charter of Rights and Freedom. Clifford Sosnow, co-chair of the International Trade and Investment Group at Fasken Law Firm, said the deeper issue is that the legislation gives the state the power to take property and not provide any compensation, even though it does not specify that the owners have violated Canadian criminal law. It is a very quick 1-2 step to dispossession of property, he said. Justice Minister David Lametti has pointed out there is no absolute right to own private property in Canada, where government already has the power to seize the proceeds of crime. I've seen this happen. I used to work in a law office. They seize the proceeds of crime even when there was no conviction. How about that? What does Pat Buchanan have to say? This is from his syndicated column. At the NATO summit in Madrid, Finland was invited to join the alliance. What does this mean for Finland? If Russian President Vladimir Putin breaches the 830-mile Finnish border, the United States will rise to Helsinki's defense and fight Russia on Finland's side. What does Finland's membership in NATO mean for America? If Putin makes a military move into Finland, the U.S. will go to war against the world's largest nation, with an arsenal of between 4,500 and 6,000 battlefield and strategic nuclear weapons. No Cold War president would have dreamed of making such a commitment to risk the survival of our nation to defend territory of a country thousands of miles away that has never been a U.S. vital interest. To go to war with the Soviet Union over the preservation of Finnish territory would have been seen as madness during the Cold War. Recall, Harry Truman refused to use force to break Joseph Stalin's blockade of Berlin. Dwight Eisenhower refused to send U.S. troops to save the Hungarian freedom fighters from being cut down by Soviet tanks in Budapest in 1956. And I will add, this was after weeks of official U.S. government propaganda outlets like Radio Liberty broadcasting to Hungary, revolt, 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 we'll have your back. No, they didn't. Lyndon B. Johnson did nothing to assist the Czech patriots crushed by Warsaw Pact armies in 1968, when Lech Walesa's solidarity was smashed on Moscow's order in Poland in 1981. Ronald Reagan made brave statements and sent Xerox machines. While the U.S. issued annual declarations of support during the Cold War for the so-called captive nations of Central and Eastern Europe, the liberation of these nations from Soviet control was never deemed so vital to the West as to justify a war with the USSR. Indeed, in the 40 years of the Cold War, NATO, which had begun in 1949 with 12 member nations, added only 4 more: Greece, Turkey, Spain, and West Germany. All the nations once part of Moscow's Warsaw Pact, East Germany, Poland, Hungary, the Czech Republic, Slovakia, Romania, Bulgaria, are now members of the US-led NATO directed against Russia. 3 former republics of the USSR, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, are now also members of NATO, a military alliance formed to corral and contain the nation to which they had belonged during the Cold War. Lithuania, with 2% of Russia's population, has just declared a partial blockade of goods moving across its territory to Kaliningrad, Russia's enclave on the Baltic Sea. It is a dictum of geostrategic politics that a great power ought never cede to a lesser power the ability to draw it into a great war. Yes, in 1914, the Kaiser's Germany gave its Austrian ally a so-called blank check to punish Serbia for its role in the assassination of the Archduke Francis Ferdinand, heir to the Austrian throne. Vienna cashed the Kaiser's check and attacked Serbia, and the Great War of 1914-18 was on. In March 1939, Neville Chamberlain issued a war guarantee to Poland. If Germany attacked Poland, Britain would fight on Poland's side. Fortified with this war guarantee from the British Empire, the Poles stonewalled Hitler, refusing to talk to Berlin over German claims to the city of Danzig, taken from her at the 1919 Paris Peace Conference. On September the 1st, 1939, Hitler attacked and Britain declared war, a war that lasted 6 years and mortally wounded the British Empire. I should add that France stupidly joined the guarantee, Britain's guarantee to Poland. Neither France nor Britain was in any position to guarantee the guarantee. What are you going to do about it? And they did nothing. Oh, I believe the Saar or something was invaded by France, which lasted, I don't know, about half an hour or something like this. And let's go to Moon of Alabama to find out the latest from the Ukraine. New York Times continues to report strikes on civilians that somehow happen to hit military targets. Just last week, the New York Times reported of a Russian strike on civilians in Chasiv Yar, even though its own reporter at the location acknowledged in a detailed separate report that the apartment complex that was hit was mostly housing military forces. Yesterday, a Russian missile strike hit the town of Vinnytsia in western Ukraine. The New York Times is again lamenting about damage to civilian buildings, even as the main target was obviously a military one. And this is what's called using civilians as human shields, which is supposed to be a war crime. But if the Ukrainians do it, well, let's embrace the noble lie here that the Ukrainians are doing exactly what they accused the Russians of doing, but the Ukrainians are the good guys. So we shouldn't complain. In fact, we should look for opportunities, in fact, as the New York Times instructed us several months ago, to find things to lie about. The aforementioned John Ivison, oh, yes, I'm blocked, so I'll have to open it in a private window. He has another tearjerker of a tweet here about this. Let me scroll down. A window into the depravities of Russia's war. 25 young women held in a basement and gang raped by soldiers. 9 became pregnant. There will be a reckoning in this world or the next. Yes, there will be a reckoning. This is U.S. government propaganda, given that the Ukrainian army, well, they let out everyone in prison and gave them AK-47s, that this is a ragtag group of Nazis and untrained young men, assuming that anyone was raped in this basement. I'm going to go with the Ukrainians having done it. Remember, these are people who tortured Russian soldiers on camera and then put the videos up on social media. Now, what kind of people would do that? I've got a pretty good idea what kind of people would do that. But, there are oligarchs and Nazis, so we must remain steadfast in support of them. Anything else would be something Munich 1938. Let's go to Pedro Gonzalez. Okay, here we go. This is from the Department of Defense. News, U.S. provided HIMARS effective in Ukraine. Michael Tracy comments, totally reliable news updates from a totally reliable news service right here. Johan Miranda tweets, after being undocumented for 30 years, I've finally been approved for a U.S. green card, which in 2022 feels like scoring a ticket to the Titanic. Grateful buggers, aren't they? Pedro Gonzalez comments, you don't deserve citizenship. The fact you weren't deported is an indictment of the immigration system. Andrew Desiderio tweeted, House GOP aghast at one of their own Ukraine-born Representative Victoria Spartz for her attacks on Zelensky and his inner circle, fearing she's fueling the MAGA wing's Ukraine skepticism. The U.S. intel community is now getting involved. Sounds serious. Pedro Gonzalez comments, the word for Republicans who are uncomfortable with being critical of Zelensky and don't want you to question our involvement in Ukraine is traitor. That is the word Republican voters need to use more against their own politicians. David Reboy commented on the same tweet, this is very weird and troubling. It seems this Ukrainian GOP congresswoman isn't allowed to have her own opinion on Zelensky. Notice how her criticisms aren't even mentioned other than to say they've been discredited. And now the intelligence community is getting involved. What, are they going to send her to Guantanamo, perhaps? Let's go back to the chat. Yes, the jaunty Edwardian ditties, jaunty, whimsical Edwardian ditties of yore. Was this all appliances cut briefly in southeast England? And okay, I can't read that. Who else do we have here? I had a full brekkie, and yeah, I don't know where. I don't know that I like where this is going. Quachalango says ridiculous 28 people in the world. I mean, love y'all. Okay. All right. I don't really understand that. Conversely, if KMG's numbers get too high, they will just access channels, says David the Gnome. I have had that thought for quite a long time, which is one of the reasons that I don't aspire to guru status. Debate, Christopher versus Peter Hitchens. Anran says Peter is much better than his late brother, but still says a lot of dumb stuff. I don't like Peter Hitchens' defeatism. Doom Sparrow, I always say. Also, his continued vilification of Enoch Powell. I mean, the fact that Enoch was right seems to enrage people more than what he actually said in his famous Birmingham speech. And I kind of like these smaller streamers. Numbers equal safe, says Don Willis. And Doom Sparrow. Yes, it means while there is breath, there is hope. Again, Kevin's suspensions off YT must have hurt his numbers. I don't really pay all that much attention to the numbers, actually. There's a tendency, and I've been through this on other platforms, there's a tendency to become obsessed with these numbers. You know, back when I had a blog, I was obsessed with the numbers, and it's a waste of time. The Mighty Puck 75 says, to be fair, Kaliningrad should be German. Well, that's David Frum view, Prussian irredentist David Frum. Logically, it should be. Kaliningrad, I saw pictures of it, videos of it like 20, 30 years ago, and it just looked like a hellhole. And I thought, the Germans have plenty of money. Why don't they simply, offer to buy it from Russia? Just as America bought Alaska from Russia for, what was it, $7.2 million? Secretary of State William Seward was responsible, and for quite a long time afterwards, this was known as Seward's Folly, amazingly enough. Jibba the Gnome says, I remember my posting career had a Hood of Good collection of based Black People's Post, and they had an Asian version, and they have a Jewish version, the Shtetl of Metal. So, where are we here? Okay. Yes. The size of the millennial generation is to blame for sky-high inflation, strategist says. This is Natasha Turak at CNBC. The original headline, which was changed without a note, was millennials are to blame for sky-high inflation, strategist says. Ooh, take that, millennials. Soaring inflation is putting markets on edge and triggering fears of a recession. The latest consumer price index data this week revealed a searing 9.1% increase year over year in June, prompting Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen to say that inflation in the U.S. is unacceptably high. The causes behind the steep jumps include high commodity and energy prices triggered by supply shortages and Russia's war in Ukraine. The second part of that is entirely a self-inflicted wound. Record government spending packages on economic stimulus and low interest rates amid the COVID-19 pandemic, and continuing labor shortages and supply chain problems meeting increased demand. Of course, COVID-19, again, entirely a self-inflicted wound. But one investor is arguing that there's another factor to blame: millennials. Boo! See, what everyone is not including in the conversation is what really causes inflation, which is too many people with too much money chasing too few goods. Actually, it has an enormous amount to do with the money supply. Bill Smead, Chief Investment Officer at Smead Capital Management, told CNBC's Squawk Box Europe Thursday. Snead explained that in the U.S., there are an estimated 92 million millennials, primarily in the 27 to 42-year-old age bracket. The last time we saw that, what we call Wolverine inflation, which is inflation that is hard for policymakers to stop, was when 75 million baby boomers had replaced 44 million silent generation people in the 1970s. Again, apparently nothing to do with a wild expansion of the money supply. So we have in the United States a whole lot of people aged 27 to 42 who postponed home buying, car buying for about 7 years later than most generations. But in the past 2 years, they've all entered the party together. And this is just the beginning of a 10 to 12-year time period when there's about 50% more people that are wanting these things than there were in the prior group. So the Fed can tighten credit, but it won't reduce the number of people wanting these necessities in comparison to the prior group. Oh, so you can just put off buying a home for 7 years and just in the expectation that the cost of homes isn't going to explode, or the cost of buying a car isn't going to explode. Millennials grew up at a time where it was simply expected that houses would become ever more expensive because, you got to bet on real estate always because they're not making any more of it. Remember that? Do they still say that? And more on millennials from Unheard. Boy, this is from Joel Kotkin. Why millennials are dropping out. With inflation soaring, trust in governments plummeting, and the global economy teetering on the brink of collapse, one might expect to see the masses out in the streets calling for the heads of their rulers. But instead of rage and rebellion, we mostly see apathy. Rather than getting radicalized, people are dropping out. Is there a mention of drugs in this essay? No, there is not. I have pointed out, quite some time ago, what is the reason for marijuana legalization, apart from the idiot libertarianism of our elite? Urban pacification. That's the reason. But back to Joel Kotkin. Political alienation is at a high as headlines proclaim disaster after disaster, from the pandemic to recession to the climate, quote, apocalypse. People are losing their faith in the future. In the U.S., public trust in government is lower today than it was after Watergate, and Americans are disengaging massively from politics on social media and cable news. In the world's democracies, voter turnout has dropped from an average of 80% in the 80s to closer than 60% today. More than half of that decline reflects generational change. In the U.S., for instance, citizens between the ages of 18 and 29 typically turn out at a rate more than 10 points lower than those over the age of 30. Lower turnout, particularly among the young, has skewed politics towards the extremes. In France, barely 40% of the electorate voted in the recent election, part of what Le Monde described as political de-socialization. Those under 35 who did bother favored Jean-Luc Mélenchon, the H. Trotskyite, or Marine Le Pen, the doyenne of French fascism, over President Emmanuel Macron, who embodies the technocratic center. A similar pattern is playing out in the United States. As apathy rises, young voters have tended to favor more ideologically extreme candidates, such as Bernie Sanders, who in the 2016 primaries won more votes from people under 30 than Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton combined. But for the most part, young Americans are rejecting the system altogether. According to the political scientist Yascha Mounk, while more than two-thirds of older Americans still embrace democracy, only 1 in 3 millennials do. Well, if you're going to talk about the oldies, of people my age or older, the systems worked pretty well for them, particularly if they managed to ride the inflation train in housing, to give one example. And they got much better health care in my country than young people are getting now. To give another example, the cost of education was not preposterous for the boomers. Kotkin continues, it would be one thing if people were merely tuning out of politics, but they're increasingly dropping out of the economy as well. In Japan, the historical heartland of workaholics, observers in the 80s began to note the rise of the Shinjinri, or the new race. These were young people who rejected work for a lifetime as freeters, often living with their parents and spending their time traveling, playing video games, and pursuing hobbies, also watching a lot of porn. Lately, a similar phenomenon has spread elsewhere in Asia, including China, where millennials have abandoned striving in favor of lying flat. Well, of course, there's reasons for this. The boomers haven't left, for one. And did you go to a top-ranked school? Tell me about your parents. Are your parents powerful, influential? Do your parents have enough money to pay for your unpaid internships, etc.? Not to mention the fact that public education has been rubbish in North America for quite some time compared to what it used to be, even when the boomers were young, not to mention, in the decades before that. Kotkin continues, even before the pandemic, there were rising labor shortages in Europe, which are expected to become more severe in the future. But the problem isn't limited to Europe, and the U.S. labor force participation fell from its peak of 67.1% in 2000 to 61% today. A 2021 report from the Chamber of Commerce noted that as recently as 2012, there were 4 available workers for every job. Now that number is barely 1.4, half the historic average. The decline is particularly marked among men, whose participation rate has dropped by 5% since 1980. Today, an estimated 1/3 of America's working age males are not working. Perhaps one of the reasons they're not working is that in our new go forward offices, men are not really wanted. The answer to why so many are dropping out starts with economics. In the United States, social mobility has declined precipitously over the last 4 decades. A 2016 study found that since the early 80s, the chance of middle-class earners moving up to the top rungs of the earnings ladder dropped by approximately 20%. According to projections from Deloitte, by 2013, millennials will be the largest adult generation by far, but will own only 16% of the country's wealth. Gen Xers will hold 31%, while baby boomers, who will be entering their 80s and 90s, will control 45%. I guess that's unless they're murdered for their money. Oh, not murdered, persuaded to embrace medically assisted dying, as they call it. Partly, this is a result of the post-pandemic reluctance to take low wages or accept jobs in the so-called gig economy, where pay and hours are often uncertain. Some low-wage workers have also found state support during the pandemic to be, in many cases, more profitable than work itself. In countries such as Italy and Spain, high levels of public welfare delinked from work have also been associated with the persistently high employment. Kotkin concludes, in the future, the disaffected masses could find themselves living more like prisoners than citizens. Avoiding that outcome requires finding ways to replace disaffection with ambition and a commitment to human progress. The habit of despair is worse than despair itself, Albert Camus noted in The Plague. Absent a recommitment to growth and democracy, we can expect a future of stagnation and ever growing inequality, one in which we, lacking the will and capacity to create new riches, may find ourselves reduced to fighting like junkyard dogs over the scraps of a diminished world. More fun with headlines. And this is even better than the last one. I guess it's the first bite of the apple, the first go for it that really tells how people think. So here's a headline from Politico, and this the 13th, 2 days ago, a story by Victoria Guida. There's only one hopeful sign for the Fed on inflation: reality. Okay, you want to know what the original headline was? And this is stored at that strange site called DNYUZ, which is based in Armenia, someplace like that, which seems to specialize in stealing IP from places like the New York Times. Here's the original headline, same story, original headline: pay raises are getting smaller. That could be a good thing for workers. Yes. Wage gains for American workers are beginning to slow, threatening one of the few positive trends for the economy since the pandemic. But that could be good news for the nation's labor force. The government Wednesday reported that inflation soared 9.1% in June, the biggest 12-month jump since November 1981. Prices rose across the board, but not because of salary increases, which actually leveled off in recent months. That matters because if prices and wages keep pushing each other up, the Federal Reserve, already under tremendous strain to rein in inflation, might be forced to move even faster to ramp up interest rates, throwing people out of work and thrusting the economy into a painful recession. Instead, slower wage growth could help bring down prices and ultimately mean less sting for the average worker. Fewer dollars in your pay packet. Doesn't that give you a good feeling? This is similar to the argument about globalization. Yeah, but things are cheaper. Yeah, it's very, yeah, so computers are cheaper and television sets are cheaper. I don't have a job. How does this benefit me? Or the best job that I can get is minimum wage. These low prices, how do they benefit people with no jobs or people who are earning very little? And in any event, we had this debate in the 70s and 80s in America, Britain, and elsewhere. Ooh, it was evil workers demanding higher wages that were responsible for stagflation. No, it wasn't. It was expansion of the monetary supply. That simple. And more economic news from the conservative treehouse. The producer price index is essentially the tracking of wholesale prices at three stages: origination, commodity, intermediate, processing, and then final to wholesale. Today, the Bureau of Labor and Statistics released June price data showing another 11.3% increase year over year in final demand products at the wholesale level. And I'm sure this is due to greedy workers demanding increases to keep up with the cost of living. And this is from wolfstreet.com. It gets ugly. Inflation shifts to services. Food, fuel spike $2. Purchasing power swoons. Oh, dearie, the Fed is going to meet in late July and is going to talk about services inflation. This is by Wolf Richter. I suspect that's not his actual name. Oh, maybe it is. The website is called Wolf Street, so maybe that is his moniker. Services are now starting to power this inflation, and services are where people spend the biggest part of their budget. It's where inflation is now getting entrenched, independent of commodity prices, and where it's very tough to bring inflation under control. The declining commodity prices may help contain food prices and gasoline prices, but not services. Inflation in June was also driven by food and gasoline, where it's staring consumers in the face on a daily basis, though some of the price pressures are now abating. and prices of durable goods, such as cars and electronics, are rising at a less ugly pace. And let's go now to, this is a tweet. You're going to have to give me a second here to bring this up because of a deficiency in Microsoft Word. Okay, here we go. This is from Election Wiz, inflation hitting hard. Groceries up 12% in past year, biggest annual increase since 1979. Chicken up 19% in past year, biggest increase ever. Gas up 60%, biggest since 1981. Electricity up 14%, biggest since 2006. Rent up 5.8%, biggest since 1986. Elisa Martinez responded, remember when the Democrats in power said the $1.9 trillion stimulus was paid for and would not increase inflation? Yep, they lied about that too. Lawyer for Laws responds to Elisa Martinez, why are there no consequences for being so wrong? Nancy Pelosi says the $1.9 trillion bill will not cause inflation since it is paid for. Chris P. Bacon responded, when you have $30 trillion in debt, nothing is paid for. But of course, as I and others have been saying, well, I've been saying it for over a decade, this money that is owed is never going to be paid back because it can't be paid back. What are you going to slash the budget by 30, 40, 50, 60%? No, that is not going to happen, short of a catastrophe or, a collapse of various polities around the world. It's not going to be paid back. There's going to be defaults, and there's going to be, as many like myself have been predicting for a long time, inflation. Inflation eats away at that debt rather quickly, and that's what we're getting now. But I'm sure that's just a coincidence, just entirely a coincidence. And in more economic news, this is from altmarket.us, written by Brandon Smith and originally published at the Birch Gold Group. Currencies are the lifeblood of trade and the economy. If a currency fails, the entire economy fails. Yet most people rarely think about the health or buying power of the money in their pocket. People don't research how often currencies actually falter and how common it is for inflation or stagflation to strike nations. They just assume that the money they have will be as useful tomorrow as it is today. They also assume that money will never change in a dramatic way. This lack of interest in how money works is likely due to the fact that people are not taught how their money is created. It's not discussed in schools, the truth is avoided in colleges, and the mainstream news rarely mentions it. People think our government and treasury handles all of that, but the reality is that our government does not create our money. At least it's not in charge of the process. Central bankers are, and they operate from a quasi-independent position. For example, former Federal Reserve Chairman Alan Greenspan once openly admitted that the central bank, quote, answers to no one, unquote, and does not follow orders from the government. They do what they want when they want. This attitude should concern you because it is a long-held argument among critics of the Fed that they are an unelected body with ultimate power to destroy the economy and the dollar at will if they want to. Sure, the U.S. president gets to choose the next successive chairman from a list of candidates that is given to him by the Fed, of course, and Congress could conceivably call for a full audit of the Fed's financial actions and policies, but they never do because it would never be allowed by the banks or their political partners. The central bank is the most powerful institution in America by far. It is completely unaccountable and uncontrollable. There is only ever the question of public reaction. This is the one thing the bankers fear. They are afraid that the public will learn who they are and what the central bank does. They are afraid that their actions and policies will anger the public enough to inspire rebellion. They are afraid that the torches and pitchforks will one day come out. So they divert blame as much as possible for the damage that they cause. Apologists for the Fed claim that the central bank only creates money from thin air when the government asks them to, And so it's the politicians that are to blame. This is a lie. The politicians go begging to the Fed for more money, and the Fed usually obliges, while also creating tens of trillions of dollars on the side for their friends in the corporate world. For example, only one time in recent history has a Fed policy action been investigated by the Government Accounting Office. This audit was of a single set of bailouts enacted by the bank, and it was only allowed because the public was starting to get wise to the bank's activities thanks to Ron Paul's presidential campaign. The audit was designed to shut people up. But what was found was startling, and so the media swept the info under the rug. Over $16 trillion in fiat money had been conjured by the Fed in the span of a few years, while the original claim was that mere billions had been created for the bailouts starting in 2008. Keep in mind that this audit was limited only to a particular set of bailouts. It was not a full audit of the Fed's entire operation. We truly have no idea how many dollars the central bank has created out of thin air since the credit crash began. We can only reference the Fed's own data, which is probably not very honest. The only thing that limits central banks from total monetary dominion is the fact that physical dollar holdings and even digital bank transfers can be accounted for. Once those dollars are out in the ether, there's not much the central bank can do to hide them, and eventually inflation will reveal the truth. The bankers need a new system which allows them total control of every single penny from creation to circulation. They want the ability to make money appear or disappear in real time. More than that, they want the ability to track every single dollar, including who has them and what they are using them for. They want to be able to micromanage trade and thus achieve a financial totalitarian empire. Enter central bank digital currencies, CBDCs, based on blockchain technology. Ever wonder why the mainstream media has been hyping up cryptocurrencies like Bitcoin for the past few years? Ever wonder why major banks like Goldman Sachs and JP Morgan have been pumping billions of dollars into crypto infrastructure and research in private, while at the same time bashing crypto in the news? Ever wonder why central banks have been dismissing crypto as dangerous, while at the same time developing their own cryptocurrencies? It is because they are easing the masses into the notion of a fully digital trade system in which physical money no longer exists. Central banks might act like they are suspicious of crypto, but in reality, they love it. The Bank for International Settlements, also known as the Central Bank of Central Banks, recently released a survey which states that at least 81 central banks around the world have been accelerating plans to release their own cryptocurrencies. Many excuses are given, including the COVID pandemic, but they're actually working on these digital products well before the pandemic began. The International Monetary Fund has been talking about developing a global cryptocurrency system tied to their special drawing rights basket for years. Numerous globalist institutions have been pursuing the technology, and it's nothing new. What is new, though, is banks openly admitting to the plan. The BIS, one of the most clandestine globalist organizations that still has a public face, has even admitted that it is developing CBDC tech. And what this tells me is that we're very close to a sea change in our economic environment. Generally, criminals will not reveal their criminality unless they think it's too late for anyone to do anything about it. With stagflation hitting our economy hard this year, we have to question if the behavior of the banks suggests much worse conditions to come. The public would never readily accept CBDCs as money unless their existing money lost most of its buying power and the current system was in the gutter. This is how new levels of empire are born. A major crisis allows for the elites to consolidate control, while the people are distracted by their own private disasters. The big picture is changed while each person is terrified by their own small picture calamity. In the US, markets and mainstream economists are just praying the Fed capitulates on interest rates hikes because they think this would save stocks from collapse. However, even if the Fed did this, there would still be the problem if inflation and stagnation continues. If they don't back off rate hikes, I predict they will not capitulate or reverse course anytime soon, then there will be recession on top of price inflation. There's no way that the current speed of rate hikes is going to slow down inflation from tens of trillions of fiat dollars flowing through the global economy. As I've warned for a long time now, the Fed has created a catch-22 scenario in which the economy crashes no matter which policy decision they make. But what if this was all by design? With the introduction of CBDCs in the wake of a stagflationary crash, the central banks could call for new global network currencies to stop such a crisis from ever happening again. The BIS and the IMF will be ready and waiting with the SDR basket or something very similar. The bankers will remove all physical money over a short period of time, and a global digital system will take over. All privacy in trade will be gone, except for those people involved in barter, black markets, and commodities. The advent of CBDCs could also mean that money and economic participation will become privileges, not rights. Digital trade could be tied to a social credit system, much like the one that exists in communist China. Want access to your checking and savings accounts? Better not say anything critical of the establishment, or you could be reported by a neighbor or stranger by cell phone app and have your money disappear in seconds. The onus will then be on you to prove that you were loyal and get access back. You are guilty until proven innocent. Maybe you don't want to take the next untested mRNA vaccine for the next dubious pandemic threat. You'll have little choice if your ability to function economically is controlled digitally. And our essayist concludes, this is the world we are facing if we allow central banks to fully digitize money and trade. It is a nightmare environment of complete authoritarianism. The public at large is mostly unaware of the incredible danger inherent in CBDCs, and they must be educated before the current crisis grows so large that they can no longer focus on anything other than their own problems. Again, this is an essay by Brandon Smith, originally published at the Birch Gold Group, birchgold.com. And I think that's enough about the economy for now. But let's talk about the pandemic. It's not over. It's never going to be over, because our leaders don't want it to be over. And they can count on the fanatical approval, I would say about 30% of the people. Somewhat astonishing story from Connor Boyd at the Daily Mail. 3 in 10 Britons have stayed at home to avoid COVID in the last month, and more than 40% have worn a face mask as fears about the virus start to take hold again, a survey suggests. The UK is currently in the midst of a mild fifth wave that has been seen infections rise for the past month, with 3.5 million people carrying COVID last week, although deaths and ICU admissions have remained flat. An exclusive poll from Mail Online found 29% of people have stayed indoors at some point since cases began rising to avoid catching the virus, while 42% have worn a covering. Almost half observed social distancing rules that have not been in place since February, while 2/3 said that they had sanitized their hands. I think these 2/3 of people are lying. Or perhaps conditions in Britain are very different than they are in Victoria, British Columbia, long known as Canada's most British city. I'm not seeing anyone sanitizing their hands. No one. Just 16% of people, around 1 in 6, have not taken any precautions over the last month, according to the survey of 1,500 Britons. NHS bosses privately expect the latest wave to fizzle out naturally in the coming weeks without any need for onerous public health measures. And Mail Online's analysis of the latest official hospital figures suggests the latest wave is plateauing. But that has not stopped individual hospitals, GP surgeries, care homes, and some schools from reintroducing face masks and social distancing in recent weeks. And across Britain's towns and cities, a growing share of the public appear to be donning masks again in shops, supermarkets, and on public transport. Retail bosses have warned Britain is in danger of becoming a nation of hypochondriacs. I guess that's what happens when you have a nation of people with guilty consciences. Let's go to Eugippius's Substack, as I am wont to do. Christian Drosten is still mad about the Great Barrington Declaration. Eugippius writes, unfortunately, I spent most of yesterday on a train and most of the day in meetings, so I can only offer you some brief thoughts as I prepare my long-promised review of Viral. I was amused to see Christian Drosten answer this tweet by Great Barrington Declaration co-author Jay Bhattacharya. Dr. Bhattacharya, tweeted 2 days ago, a few months ago, Drosten labeled me, Martin Kulldorff, and Sunitra Gupta saboteurs to excuse the failure of Germany's COVID suppression strategy. Imagine a policy so fragile that it is sabotaged by nothing other than 3 people voicing an opposing idea. That is lockdown. He answered this with the complaint that Bhattacharya was lying. This is a lie. What I did is highlight an opinion piece in The Guardian. Here is the original tweet. It does not mention any names. You are using falsifications to extend your reach. Shame on you. Perhaps Drosten hoped that few would bother to translate his slanderous German, so I'll do it for you. Tweet. This article, he's linking to a hyperbolic op-ed in The Guardian, calls corona relativism with its blind comparisons to influenza, its all too premature suggestion that we should learn to live with the virus, and the Great Barrington as argument of targeted protection of at-risk groups by its name, sabotage, unquote. Whether any fair-minded person will agree that Bhattacharya misrepresented Drosten here is a side matter. More interesting is that Drosten answered it all. He has over 1 million Twitter followers. He's tagged thousands of times a day, and as Twitter users go, he's relatively inactive. No, the reason this is interesting is that it underlies how much the Great Barrington Declaration continues to bother our not-so-brilliant regime virologists. Through the hours and hours of his vacuous podcast and associated media appearances, Drosten has rarely bothered to disagree with anybody. His primary achievement consisted in saying nothing much specific, while affirming Merkel government policies wherever possible. Yet in this, the Great Barrington Declaration was a big exception for Drosten. He has attacked its authors in thinly veiled ways several times now. Especially revealing is his enthusiastic agreement with the Guardian columnist that Bhattacharya, Kuldorf, and Gupta are guilty of sabotage. This is not a word anyone would apply to intellectual opponents or to colleagues with merely different opinions about the proper cost-benefit analysis of a policy. The whole flap shows that Drosten is playing a very different kind of game. In the confidence that he knew what the science ought to be, Drosten decided to lie and present a false facade of certainty about what the science is. This explains his irrational anger at colleagues who refuse to toe the line, because Drosten's ultimate security is unanimity. Astrologers are frequently wrong, but that needn't be a problem as long as they're no wronger than any other astrologers. This use of this word sabotage is revealing, with my opinion, not Eugipius's. There's something very Soviet about it. Again, I've been rereading about Joseph Stalin. Wreckers, that's another word that the Bolsheviks love to use. They also love this phrase, former persons. And you see the goal of cancel culture, and the signatories of the Great Barrington Declaration were canceled, is to make people former persons. And that's a good thing, apparently, because we don't want these people polluting our world with their insanity. And that's exactly the way they look at it. Of course, in the latter days of the Soviet Union, political dissidents were declared insane and put in asylum. Here's Alex Berenson, and he's talking about my country of Canada. Vaccinated people are now more likely to be hospitalized or die from COVID, even after adjusting for the fact they're older than the unvaccinated, according to official government estimates from the Canadian province of Manitoba. In May, the most recent month for which figures are available, only 9% of COVID deaths and 14% of hospital admissions in Manitoba occurred among unvaccinated people, even though they are 17% of the population. Manitoba, which is about 1.4 million residents, also provides figures that are adjusted for the fact that vaccinated and boosted people tend to be older. Those show that in May, vaccinated but unboosted people were about 50% more likely to be hospitalized or die of COVID than unvaccinated people. People who had received boosters had roughly the same risk of hospitalization or death as the unvaccinated. How about that? These figures and estimates differ markedly from those of the Centers for Disease Control, but they are far more likely to be accurate. American hospitals and health authorities classify COVID deaths and hospitalizations as occurring in the unvaccinated until proven otherwise. Countries with national health insurance can match their vaccination registries much more easily against hospital admissions and death, and they have consistently shown much higher percentages of COVID deaths in unvaccinated people. Still, the data from Manitoba appear to mark the first time that any government agency has actually found a higher risk of death in vaccinated people. That should end the argument. Shouldn't it end the argument? As I've been saying for what, 12 months now or so? When the statistics from Israel and Ireland, Scotland, and England and Wales were coming out, are we supposed to believe that the physiognomy of these people is not the physiognomy, the physiology of these people is radically different from our own in Canada or the United States? No, it obviously could not be. Oh no, these are outliers. Well, it would seem to me there's a significant amount of difference between, say, the British Isles and Israel. If you find the same sort of statistics about efficacy of a medical treatment in those two places, that seems to me to be pretty significant. And I think this should end the argument about vaccines. But we shall see. Let's go back to Joseph Tainter's Collapse of Complex Societies. Must every complex society endure this process? That is to say, collapse. Does investment in complexity always come to the point where the marginal return declines? Modern economic research would not yield a clear answer to that question. The argument made here is only that where this process is operative and continues unchecked, a society will be thereby made vulnerable to collapse. Certainly, it would seem that to the extent less costly organizational solutions are chosen before more expensive ones, the need to add organizational features must regularly yield a declining marginal return. Yet among societies with the necessary capital, technological springboard, and economic and demographic incentives, obtaining a new energy subsidy through empire building or by exploiting a new energy source or economic development can for a time either reverse a declining marginal curve or at least provide the wealth to finance it. Renfrew makes precisely this point in regard to the evolution of complexity in Greece and the Aegean. It must be admitted that this approach removes much of the mystery of collapse and identifies it as a mundane economic matter. It is, as Findlay would say, neither a dramatic nor a romantic way to look at the great cataclysms of history. One could not make a film out of it. Further implications of declining marginal returns. It may seem from this work that archaeology is campaigning to displace economics as the so-called dismal science. Of course, the marginal product curve is nothing new. It was developed to characterize changing cost/benefit curves in resource extraction and input-output ratios in the manufacturing sector. The idea of diminishing returns to economic activity is at least as old as the 19th century classical economists Thomas Malthus, David Ricardo, and John Stuart Mill. It applies to subsistence agriculture, minerals and energy production, information processing, and to many features of socio-political organization. Wittfogel applied the concept of administrative returns to the extension of government into economic affairs in Oriental despotisms. Lattimore accounted for the Chinese dynastic cycle in terms of increasing and declining returns. It appears that Kroeber's observations on the fulfillment of art styles may refer to a situation where innovation within a style becomes increasingly difficult to achieve, leading to repetition and rearrangement of earlier work, and ultimately to a new style in which innovation is more easily attained. The phenomenon is not at all limited to the human species. Animal predators seem to follow the principle of marginal returns in their selection of environmental patches in which to forage. The familiar explanation of collapse, the Peasant Revolt, deserves comment here. It seems insufficient to suggest that peasants' revolt are due to an unfair level of taxation, for cases can be presented, for example, the Maya, where a peasantry endured exacting demands for centuries. What seems more likely to be pertinent is the marginal return on such support, and more particularly, any pattern of significant decline in this return. Peasant political action would be substantially more intelligible in this light. In modern peasant revolts, of course, other factors are involved, such as an intelligentsia adhering to an international ideology who are able to make peasantry aware of their marginal status. In any event, mere taxation level is an insufficient explanation of peasant action in this area. Some concept of cost-benefit ratios is required. Gordon Childe had some pertinent observations on the matter. Quote, "The instability of these early empires discloses a contradiction within them. The persistence with which the subject peoples revolted is a measure of their gratitude for the benefits of empires, and perhaps the latter's value too. Presumably the benefits were more than outweighed by disabilities. In reality, an empire of the Sargon type probably did directly destroy more wealth than it indirectly created, unquote. Among his many astute observations, Polybius suggested that the triumph of Rome over Carthage was due to the fact that the former was increasing in power and the latter declining when they came into conflict. In a somewhat similar vein, Elman Service applied his law of evolutionary potential to suggest that older established states become fossilized, unable to adopt innovations, and are thus outcompeted by newer, if smaller, peripheral peoples. It would be worthwhile for historians to investigate the marginal return on organizational investment that such competitors experience. An older established state is likely to be investing in so many cumulative organizational features that its marginal return on these investments has begun to decline, leaving lower and lower reserves with which to contain stress surges. It is then understandable that such a nation is outcompeted by less complex peoples who invest in little but warfare and experience a favorable return on their investment. Polybius's views on Rome and Carthage, seen thus, might be extended to Rome's conquest of so many older established states and confederations about the eastern Mediterranean. I will have more from Joseph Tainter's Collapse of Complex Societies Monday. Now, so Tainter is talking about surpluses and stress surges. Well, it was obvious with the near total economic collapse, certainly a collapse of credit in 2007 to 2008, that whatever surplus capitalism had created was gone. It was simply gone. So was there any great reform in the system? No, the people responsible for the disaster of 2007 to 2008 were given even more power and wealth. So we have this entirely self-inflicted wound of the corona doom. And so the solution is to print money, an astonishing amount of money, and distribute it amongst people who lost their jobs because of government panic. And, oh, it's all paid for. No, how could this be paid for? It's not paid for. This was a tremendous stress surge, but there was no surplus to deal with the stress surge. So a vast amount of money was created, and now the bill has come due. Well, it's coming due, and it will continue to come due, and we'll see this play out over a monthly basis. Let's go back to the chat. Okay, here we go. Mercurius Olycus says, I wouldn't mind visiting Hungary, also Transylvania. Me as well. Of course, would be I would assume that a great many people in Hungary speak English. That would be my guess, because Hungary is a Finno-Ugric language, which is largely incomprehensible to the whole of the world outside of Hungary. Even most famous Hungarian ever, Franz Liszt, never learned more than a few words of it. Although he grew up, he was born in Riding, which was then part of a Hungarian-speaking part of Hungary, which is now part of Austria. Later, after he moved to Paris, France became his first language, and he was far more fluent in French than any other language. Tainter still living in Utah, asks Oscar Toe. I don't know about that. Ruslan Akhmatov says, if I ever make it to Hungary, I will probably start weeping upon landing or kiss the ground. I can't repeat your last comment there, Ann Run. I got banned from YouTube before for saying this. Don Willis says, note to self, when a woman wants saran wrap, go get saran wrap. Oh, did you buy a cheap imitation? Listening to KMG will put us 30% towards the gulag, says Quachulango. Okay. So enjoy it while we can. All right. Well, Sidney Smith, the English author, editor, once famously said his piece of advice was take short views and trust in God. I mean, People can take the long view, but what's the long view going to be? We don't really know. The short view, most of the time, is things are going to be pretty much the same. No, I mangled the quotation. Sidney Smith said, take short views, trust in God, and hope for the best, which I think is generally pretty good advice. Female comics from LA, says Quachalango. Okay. I'm more worried about female comics from Australia. There's this large woman who has a cult. She's been given a bunch of specials. And what basically she just rants at the audience about men and how horrible they are. I'm trying to, perhaps one of you knows her name. Heather something? No, it's not Heather McDonald. I'm just going to look up Australian comic feminist. Well, there may be a lot of them. There are 4 prominent Australian. Indira Naidu. Yeah, that sounds like a real Australian. Hannah Gatsby. That's her name. Hannah Gatsby. Deliberately unfunny because, jokes are by their nature subversive. And she is not subversive. She's the opposite of that. Undertones cover with meat and saran wrap was cool. KMG may have had that once. I remember saran wrap being very popular when I was a child. Going through a lot of saran wrap. I suppose that's because people had leftovers in those days. Oscar Toe says Tainter's social complexity is frightening and even chaotic the more you think of it. Visionary Companion says Hannah's excuse is that she is autistic, if I remember correctly. That's not an excuse. It's simply not. Hasn't Greta Thunberg taught us that autism is a superpower? No, this again. This bad. What someone in chat called it a week ago or something. The Chris Chan defense. Yeah, I'm unfunny, or I'm obnoxious, or I'm rude, or I'm cruel, even. Oh well, you see, I have a touch of the tism. So, to call me out for this would be, wait for it, ableism, and you don't want to be an ableist, do you? Div of the Gnome says to get in touch with America's Soul, I like to go on Twitter and look at the young female stand-up comics in Los Angeles, examine their feed and posts. Well, what I've seen, it happens a lot to me that I'll see some hot take, which isn't a hot take, and I'll click on the person who made it, and this person identifies himself or herself as a comedian, and that wasn't a joke, what you did. Yes, I understand that all of life isn't a joke, but Trump should be impeached. Trump should be in prison. Trump should be hanged for treason. Those aren't jokes. They're not even close to being jokes. Oh, this arrives at Mercurius Olicus says, what does chat think about Rod Dreher sodding off to Hungary? Well, his marriage broke up, and I've seen bits of it, not firsthand, because I'm not willing to pay for his Substack. Essentially, his marriage was a misery for 10 years, but he stayed in it to provide a stable environment for his children. And now he's buggered off to Hungary. He spent an awful lot of time traveling. Here's me in front of the Mount of Olives wearing a Walker Percy t-shirt. Isn't that cool? Oh, look, here's some incredibly expensive beer or cocktail or some such thing. This guy, Rod Dreher, is like a woman's Instagram. Here, look at me in this fabulous place, eating or drinking something expensive. Aren't I a better person than you? You've all seen the meme, right? The meme is a very simple meme. Man's view of a thing. There's a rectangle, and there's the thing, right? woman's view of a thing. There's the same rectangle, the same thing with the woman going like this. And it's funny because it is true. Max Vitriol, hello, says living in the Twin Cities during the Floyd riots was interesting, way too interesting for me. Yeah. No, I wouldn't have liked to have been there. The Mighty Puck 75 says, I love Canada, but you got to be rich. You can still find a few places in the USA to be non-rich. Yeah, there's a lot of truth to that. Okay, let's move on. What do we have? 25 minutes left. Okay. Oh, do I really want to get into this today near the end of the show? Okay, let's go this way. I'll say that I was going to talk about it yesterday. Immigration horror stories. I'll save that for Monday. Let's go to Jim Kunstler's column. You might have seen that Dr. Jill Biden to you was talking about how much she loves Latinx people. How do you pronounce that as a plural? Latinxes? And she talked about the wonderful diversity of these Latinx peoples. And she said they were as diverse as, I believe, breakfast tacos. So, A Tale of the Taco by Jim Kunstler. Headline: ICE could deport illegal immigrant charged with raping 10-year-old who sought abortion. What to make of this bizarre headline out of the Washington Examiner? First impression, well, that's at least one they'll send back. The story continues. U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement has requested that the Columbus, Ohio Police Department notify federal officers when 27-year-old Gerson Fuentes is released from custody so that he can be transferred to federal detention and begin removal proceedings in court. Say what? Released from custody? Removal proceedings? Why would you release a felony rape suspect from the jurisdiction of his crime, which he has confessed to, by the way, and remove him, that is, deport him, out of the USA to where exactly? And into what legal apparatus? In what other country? With what obligation to prosecute crimes committed elsewhere in the world? Meanwhile, attention in the case had shifted to the doctor in Indiana, one Caitlin Bernard, who performed the abortion. Indiana Attorney General Todd Rokita joined the rumpus. Quote, we're gathering the evidence as we speak, and we're going to fight this to the end, including looking at her licensure if she failed to report. And in Indiana, it's a crime to intentionally not report, unquote. Days later, the Indiana Star said that Dr. Bernard's rape report documents had been found. The New York Times added, Kathleen Delaney, a lawyer for Dr. Bernard, said in a statement that Dr. Bernard was considering legal action against those who had smeared her, including Rokita. You know things are bad in this country when the lawyers have to lawyer up against the doctors who lawyer up. Speaking of medical matters, do you think anyone in authority will look into whether the rape suspect, Gerson Fuentes, was vaccinated at the time of these rapes? He raped the girl on 2 separate occasions. Could he have transmitted SARS-CoV-2 to the girl? Somebody please alert Secretary of Health and Human Services Javier Becerra to make something positive of this dreadful incident. Say, produce a public service announcement to impress on Americans the urgent need for absolutely everyone to get vaccinated, including undocumented rapists. Perhaps confessed rapist Gerson Fuentes himself can make a personal appeal to the nation, since he will soon be released from custody and theoretically be available to perform on TV. I endangered a little girl. Get your vaccination. Put Gerson in the costume as a breakfast taco. It's genius. Who doesn't like them? Let's face it, America's sick and tired of seeing dour old Rochelle Walensky pitch the shots. She doesn't look anything like a breakfast taco. More like a slab of beef brisket that's been simmering overnight on the steam table, minus the bun. Has anyone noticed, by the way, that the U.S. is under an invasion of breakfast tacos? So many of them and so many kinds. Huevos con chorizo, huevos y tocino, huevos con queso. The diversity is staggering. Oddly, the U.S. fast food industry has remained silent on the issue, despite the threat to their operations. Someone, please send a memo to Homeland Security Secretary Alejandro Mayorkas. A mighty influx of breakfast tacos marches day and night across our border with Mexico. They are being distributed for free by bus and airplane from sea to shining sea, while millions of egg McMuffins, sausage, egg, and cheese croissantwiches, grand sandwiches, kickin' maple chicken breakfasts, country fried steak biscuits, chocolate chip pecan waffles, and Texas melts go uneaten, wilting under the infrared glow ray warming bulbs of American franchise eateries. The wonder really is, how can America even manage to eat breakfast with its head so far up its ass? Perhaps Dr. Jill Biden can address that question in an upcoming speech to the National Association of Colorectal Surgeons. Now that the mRNA vaccines have COVID-19 so well under control, just ask Dr. Fauci. He knows. Shouldn't we be concerned with this new scourge of cranial rectosis, the next pandemic of Americans been wearing their masks over the wrong bodily orifice? Is anyone conducting a peer-reviewed study on this? This is a grossly distressing story, the one from Ohio and Indiana. And it would seem, this is my guess, the reason that the story, there didn't seem to be any evidence that it actually happened, the story was amplified because it is the hard case that would justify Roe v. Wade, unlimited abortion. No one wants to see a 10-year-old pregnant. No one wants to see that. Forcing a 10-year-old to give birth. Then there were doubts as to whether the story was true. It seems the lack of evidence was, illegal immigrant raping the 9-year-old daughter of another illegal immigrant, which seems likely. And given, yes. Let's just read from James Fulford at VDARE. A famous case of a 10-year-old girl who got pregnant by a Guatemalan illegal. The victim's Hispanic mother seems to be either complicit or complacent in the abuse of her daughter. Jorge Bonilla, who works for the conservative MRC Newsbusters site and is bilingual, comments below. The mother of the Ohio 10-year-old rape victim tells Telemundo's Maria Vargas Pion that the child is fine and everything they say about Gerson Flores is a lie. The portion of a broader interview sheds significant light on the familial dynamics of this case and further vindicates all skepticism over how the story broke and was handled. We don't even get to this point without the critical work of Megan Fox, the writer, and so many others. This appears to confirm my thesis of a domestic situation wherein the confessed rapist is also the paramour of the victim's mother. Other familiar relation is possible, but less likely. Unfortunately, I saw many cases while working as a court interpreter. In my earlier article, I noted that Ann Coulter's Adios America includes a secret decoder ring for figuring out which of the crimes in your newspaper is an immigrant crime. It includes these 5 points. 1, the crime involves a uniquely perverse sexual assault, such as gang rape, child rape, or incest. 2, the rapist is shocked that anyone thinks he did something wrong. 3, a woman is involved in the rape or the cover-up. 4, the rapist's name would not be found in a phone book from the 1960s. 5, newspapers informatively refer to the rapist in their headlines as man. Yes. And whatever their positive points may be, it would seem incontrovertible that immigrants from Mexico and elsewhere in Central America, particularly the illegals, have a grave problem with statutory rape or worse. And speaking of America's most famous Latinx, can we call her a Latina? This is from Paul Bedard at Washington Examiner. President AOC? There's growing discussion in political circles that leftist Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez should seriously consider running for president. One reason is President Joe Biden's year-long dive in approval ratings and her surge as an alternative in 2024. In a McLaughlin and Associates survey of Biden alternatives, she sits in fourth, nearly tied with Transportation Secretary Pete Buttigieg, and behind Vice President Kamala Harris and former First Lady Michelle Obama. who has ruled out a run. Dick Morris, who managed former President Bill Clinton's re-election campaign for a while and who also advised former President Donald Trump, said Ocasio-Cortez is the heir to the socialist wing of the party and could scoop up Hispanics and liberals upset with Biden's lack of achievements and energy. Morris, who just published a book declaring that Trump will run in 2024, said the Bronx congresswoman could easily win a string of Democratic primaries and position herself at the top of the ticket. And while young, she would be the constitutionally required 35 on Inauguration Day. AOC might win primary after primary, inflaming the leftist grassroots with her charisma and radical agenda, Morris. But could she win nationally? Not a chance, according to Morris. She'd likely lose more than 40 states and maybe all 50. It would be George McGovern, Walter Mondale, or Mike Dukakis all over again. But AOC's goal is not necessarily the presidency. The doctrine of the communists and radical left is, oddly, to destroy the moderate liberal party, so there are no alternatives for centrists to embrace other than the radical faction, just like it was in pre-Nazi Germany, where the center-left Catholic Party was discredited, leaving voters to face a choice between Nazism and communism. It may not happen, but it could. You may have seen that Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez has been gravely embarrassed by a man who's been called a shtetl of metal candidate, Alex Stein. AOC on the verge of tears after catcall from Alex Stein. Pablo Manriquez tweeted, AOC tells me she's never felt safe in the Capitol, citing reports of police and members of Congress working with insurrectionists on January the 6th. This fellow, Alex Stein, who is a comedian, he heckled her on the steps of the Supreme Court, steps of Congress, calling her, saying that he loved her, and calling her his favorite big-bootied Latina woman. And she took the bait. Looked very beautiful in the dress, looked very sexy at that booty on AOC. That's my favorite big booty Latina. I love it. My favorite AOC. Look how sexy she looks in that dress. Hot like a tamale. Yeah. And she engaged in a flame war with him on Twitter. You see, you never do that. You have to judge, your status against your enemy's status. And if you're up here and he's down there, and if you get into it, it tends to go like this. So you never want to do that. Of course, who was it? Bill O'Reilly and Laura Ingraham were absolutely furious at what Stein did. And Stein fought back against this. Bill, remind me why you got fired from Fox News. Didn't you pay for multiple sexual harassment lawsuits? And yes, Laura Ingraham. He said, LOL, this is why my biological father has much better ratings than you, and please don't misgender me. Of course, AOC is, head out to the homes of the 5 justices of the Supreme Court who voted to repeal Roe v. Wade. That is in no way harassment. Do you think that the people who congregate outside the houses of Supreme Court justices or attempt to ambush them at a steakhouse are saying, respectfully, sir, Justice Kavanaugh, I beg you to reconsider your judgment in the interest of a better America? Do you think that that's what they are saying or shouting? No, that's not what they're saying or shouting. Kevin Spacey is in the news again. I believe it was today. He formally pleaded not guilty to accusations in Britain. Here's a story by Bindu Bansanath at the New York Magazine's The Cut. Oh, it is updated. On Thursday, Kevin Spacey made his second appearance at a court in London and pleaded not guilty to the multiple sexual assault charges he's facing there. The offenses, which include 4 charges of sexual assault against 3 men and 1 charge of causing a person to non-consensually engage in, I'll just say, buggery, allegedly occurred between 2005 and 2013 in the British cities of London and Gloucestershire. Okay, so there's an editorial note saying that the story's been updated. Gloucestershire is not a city in England. It is a county in England. This happened during Spacey's tenure as artistic director of London's Old Vic Theatre. Spacey, who was granted unconditional bail last month and whose lawyer has previously said he strenuously denies all criminal allegations, told Good Morning America ahead of his initial court appearance, "I am confident I will prove my innocence." Since 2017, when actor Anthony Rapp alleged that Spacey, who was starring at Netflix's House of Cards at the time, had sexually assaulted him when he was 14, over 30 men have come forward with accusations ranging from non-consensual groping to the attempted rape of minors. Spacey, 62, initially responded to Rapp's allegations with a muddled apology note in which he came out as gay, a deflection many criticized as conflating homosexuality and pedophilia, and claimed not to remember the incident, writing on Twitter, quote, "If I did behave then as Rapp describes, I owe him the sincerest apology for what would have been deeply inappropriate drunken behavior, and I'm sorry for the feelings he describes having carried with him all these years," unquote. Following the initial wave of allegations, Spacey was dropped by his talent agency and publicist, fired from House of Cards, and scrubbed from film projects. He retreated from public life, with a representative telling Variety he was seeking evaluation and treatment, though he has occasionally resurfaced over the years to launch film comebacks and post bizarre defenses on YouTube and Twitter. In October 2017, Rapp told BuzzFeed Spacey made a sexual advance after a party at Spacey's house in 1986. "I was aware that he was trying to get with me sexually," said Rapp, who alleged that after other guests left, Spacey picked him up and put him on his bed before lying on top of him. In 2020, Rapp and an anonymous accuser filed a civil sexual assault lawsuit against Spacey in New York, seeking damages for severe emotional distress. Per Reuters, Spacey categorically denied Rapp's allegations in court papers and sought to dismiss the civil lawsuit, a bid the judge rejected. Though they dismissed the second accuser's legal claims, Spacey is scheduled to stand trial at a New York federal court in October. I want to talk about this accusation made by Anthony Rapp. You may have seen him in Dazed and Confused. He plays the redhead with the long hair. Oh, he has this Jewish friend, Adam Goldberg, and another ginger, Marissa Rabini. What's her name? Giovanni Ribisi, who was married to Beck for a number of years. And they're sort of the intellectual crowd who are they're out with the jocks and the greasers and all the rest. Lovely film, Dazed and Confused. In any event, that's the only thing I've ever seen him in. But let's look at the tale that Rapp is telling here. Okay, he was 14 years old, and somehow he ended up at a party of adult homosexuals. How does that work? How does that work? Is it normal for a bunch of adult men, particularly homosexual men, to invite 14-year-olds to their parties? And if this aspect of it has passed without comment, which is highly significant to me, because it's an example where we're just going to look away. We're just going to look away from typical homosexual behavior. In an interview that I read, Rapp said he admitted to having been a homosexual when he was 14 years old, and said one of the reasons that he rejected Kevin Spacey is that he already had a boyfriend. He already had a boyfriend at the age of 14. Well, sexual activity between Rapp and anyone else at the age of 14 would be illegal in every state in the United States. This is something that was just, well, we're not going to think about that. We're just going to look away. How do 14-year-old boys have boy friends? And I'm going to suggest that, well, there's the pile-on effect that we see in cases like this. I think rap was the first, and then all of these people, they decided to add their names to it, seeking publicity or seeking money or both. I'm going to suggest that the predatory behavior that we see in people like Kevin Spacey is not in any way an anomaly. It is pretty much de rigueur in that demi-monde. Because, if it weren't, why aren't people asking the questions that I just asked? Beginning with, how is a 14-year-old boy, how does he end up at a party for homosexual men in their 30s or older? How does that happen? What are the mysteries of our age? And let's take a final look at the chat. For the record, I don't particularly like School Ties, says Anne Run. Was there you talking about School Ties or the movie School Ties? Is that a sex romp? As I recall, Rap kisses a girl in Dazed and Confused. Coincidentally, or synchronistically, as our Sting fan would say, the movie was on the Game TV network last night. And though I've seen it many times, I found myself watching it again. And there is this very cute Hispanic girl who is being hazed by Parker Posey, among others. And somehow she finds herself in the orbit of Anthony Rapp and his two friends. And it's a very attractive woman. And they are drawn to each other. And Anthony Rapp, he gives off the vibe of someone who would be too timid to approach a girl, particularly an attractive girl, on his own. So we have this sort of happy coincidence in the movie. Oh, School Ties is about anti-Semitism in the 40s or something. Just let me look it up here. Have you heard of that Apt Pupil? Have you heard of that movie? Have you heard about the accusations about the behavior of the cast director in that movie? You heard that? Joel Schumacher is lucky. I think he's lucky that he is dead. Because if he were not dead, he would get the same treatment as Kevin Spacey and Bryan Singer. Let's see. School Ties is a 1992 American sports drama directed by Robert Mandel, starring Brendan Fraser, Matt Damon, Chris O'Donnell, Randall Battenkoff, Cole Hauser, Ben Affleck, and Anthony Rapp. Okay. Screenplay by Dick Wolf. That's not promising. 60% rating on Rotty Tees, as they called it on Barry. I wonder if someone was trying to say Alec Berg was trying to make that a thing, a Rotty Tees. Hello to Van Man. Yes, we don't want to mention the oh so honored British actor in that film. I'm sure he did nothing wrong. If I recall, just let me confirm this, the adolescent star of Apt Pupil came to a bad end, as so many young men in Hollywood do. So many of them. And his name, Brad Renfro. Talented actor. I liked him very much in Ghost World. That's a film I like a lot. Beginning in the late 1990s, this is from Wiki. Renfro had difficulties in his private life, including a series of arrests and stints in drug treatment. He died of acute heroin and morphine intoxication at the age of 25. How many of the people involved in Glee have ended up dead or convicted of child pornography or just had their, lives become monstrous? But I'm sure that's just a coincidence. It's just entirely a coincidence. When he was 10 years of age, Renfro was discovered by Mally Finn, a casting director for, wait for it, Joel Schumacher. But it's just a coincidence. It's just a big coincidence that so many boys who become actors end up not just becoming homosexuals, but also end up crashing. Horrible lives, suicide, drug overdose, and the like. But again, as I say, must be entirely a coincidence, because to draw any conclusions from this or to extrapolate anything from that would be homophobia. The kid from The Shining escaped Hollywood with soul and body intact, says Helper. Well, that's because Leon Vitali was looking after him during the film, and he didn't know what the film was about. And I guess because he didn't do any acting after that. Anran says, I believe he teaches biology now at a JC and has 5 kids. Renfro got into Larry Clark's clutches, says Visionary Companion. Oscar Toe says Brad Renfro was a good actor. Van Men says, hello, Kevin. How's things? Well, it's the end of the week, and that's always good. Van Man says, listen to Bret Easton Ellis' podcast with Larry, Something Deviant Photographer, Scary Brad Renfro Story. That's it. I thank you all for tuning in. Greatly appreciated. I shall be back on the air Monday at 4 p.m. Pacific, 7 p.m. Eastern. Thanks to everyone once again for tuning in. If you'd like to make a donation to the live stream, my PayPal account is linked to kevin_grace@hotmail.com. If you're in Canada, donations may be made to the live stream directly at kevingrace@shaw.ca. And as always, I'll leave you with this benediction. In these days of social atomization and civilizational collapse, I do dearly wish that you, my dear viewers and listeners, manage to forge a genuine human connection to ease the burden. Good night.